Rich man, smirking, waving a waiter over. "Get that kid away from here. This is a place for paying customers." The boy steps forward, his voice shaking but firm. "Boy, sir, please don't eat that." The cafe falls silent. The rich man freezes, his fork inches from his mouth. Rich man, mocking. "And why not?" The boy's eyes darken. "Boy, because it's poisoned." The Parkside Cafe was the kind of place where the wealthy came to unwind, tucked away in the most exclusive part of the city. White marble floors gleamed under the golden light of expensive chandeliers, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and buttered croissants filled the air. The staff moved with precision, their uniforms crisp, their smiles carefully rehearsed. Outside, the cafe's outdoor seating area was framed by neatly trimmed hedges, separating the privileged diners from the bustling city streets just a few feet away. At a prime corner table, Jonathan Davenport, a well-groomed man in his late 50s, sat back in his chair, exuding effortless wealth. His tailored navy blue suit, gold cufflinks, and Rolex watch screamed affluence. He wasn't just another rich man. He was a self-made real estate mogul, a man who had built his fortune from the ground up. Or at least that was the narrative he liked to tell. Across from him, his business partner, Peter Caldwell, chuckled at something Jonathan had just said. The two men, accompanied by a few other associates, sipped on their espressos, discussing deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Not far from them, beyond the manicured hedges, stood Malik, a young black boy no older than 12. His oversized hoodie hung loosely on his thin frame, his sneakers worn and caked with dirt. His dark eyes darted between the tables, scanning the half-eaten plates of food, his stomach twisting with hunger. He wasn't new to this life. He had been surviving on the streets for months, watching, waiting, always invisible to the people who walked past him. But today was different. Malik wasn't just searching for food, he was searching for him. His gaze locked onto Jonathan. A spark of recognition flickered across the boy's face, a mix of anger and something deeper, something unresolved. The sound of laughter broke the moment. Jonathan clinked his glass against Peter's, a smug grin on his face. "And that's exactly why you don't trust anyone who can't afford to sit at this table," he quipped, gesturing toward the cafe entrance, where a young couple hesitated before stepping inside. The moment they start asking for help, they become a liability. The men at the table chuckled in agreement. Malik's fingers curled into fists. He took a deep breath, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He couldn't wait any longer. He stepped forward, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement, and approached the outdoor seating area. A waiter noticed him immediately and stepped in his path, holding up a hand. "We don't allow—" Malik's voice cut through the air, trembling but determined. "Sir, please, don't eat that." The entire cafe went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the boy. Even Jonathan, mid-sip, froze. Slowly he lowered his glass, arching an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Malik's hands trembled, but he held his ground. "You can't eat it. Just trust me." A second passed, then another, then laughter. Jonathan let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head in amusement. "This is a new one," he muttered. He leaned forward, looking the boy up and down like he was a street performer begging for change. "What are you trying to pull, kid? You want money? Is this some kind of scam?" Malik didn't flinch. His voice dropped, low, urgent. "It's poisoned." The laughter stopped. A hush fell over the cafe as whispers rippled through the crowd. Some diners exchanged uneasy glances, while others simply stared, waiting for the moment to unfold. Jonathan's smirk faded. His fingers, still wrapped around his fork, twitched slightly. He glanced at his plate, then back at Malik. Something in the boy's eyes unsettled him. It wasn't the look of a desperate kid making up a lie. It was something else, something real. Peter cleared his throat. "Jonathan, he's just a street kid. Let's not entertain—" Jonathan ignored him. He turned back to Malik, his voice sharper now. "Who sent you?" Malik shook his head. "No one." "Then how do you know?" Malik's breath hitched. He hadn't planned this far ahead. He had expected Jonathan to dismiss him, not actually ask questions. He had seconds to decide. Tell the truth or keep the secret buried? His stomach twisted. He chose the truth. "You don't remember me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I remember you." Jonathan's blood ran cold. Malik's hands clenched at his sides. "You ruined my family. My dad, he worked for you. And when he found out what you were doing, when he tried to expose you, you destroyed him." Jonathan's jaw tightened. A flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition? Guilt? Or just irritation? "You're lying," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Malik stepped closer, his voice unwavering. "You didn't just fire him. You made sure he could never work again. You spread lies. And when my mom got sick, we lost everything. We ended up on the street because of you." Jonathan remained silent, his grip tightening on his silverware. "You might have forgotten my dad," Malik continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "But I never forgot you." A long, tense silence followed. Then, without breaking eye contact, Malik pointed at Jonathan's plate. "And today," he whispered, "someone else didn't forget you either." Jonathan's heart stopped. The world around him blurred. The murmurs of the café faded into static. His own breath sounded too loud in his ears. He stared at the untouched plate of food in front of him. The steak, the salad, the wine. And for the first time in his life, he hesitated. The waiter, now pale, looked at Jonathan. "Sir, do you want me to—" Jonathan's chair screeched against the pavement as he stood abruptly, his pulse hammering in his throat. "Get me the manager, now." Malik didn't move. He had done what he came to do. And as Jonathan's world began to unravel, the only thing left hanging in the air was one terrifying question. Was the boy telling the truth? Or was it already too late? Jonathan Davenport's fingers twitched at his side as he stared down at the young boy standing before him. Malik's words still hung heavy in the air, poisoning the atmosphere of the once lively Parkside Café. The murmurs of curious diners swirled around them, the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on Jonathan like a lead blanket. His throat felt dry. His vision tunneled slightly as he glanced at the untouched steak on his plate, then back at the boy. "Someone else didn't forget you either." That sentence played over and over in his mind. Jonathan prided himself on being a man who never panicked. He had built an empire by keeping his emotions in check, always being the one in control. But at that moment, for the first time in years, he felt something foreign creep up his spine. Doubt. His hand shook slightly as he set down his fork. Across the table, Peter Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Jonathan, come on," he scoffed. "Are you really going to let some street kid get inside your head?" Jonathan inhaled sharply through his nose, forcing the uncertainty from his expression. He straightened his shoulders, fixing Malik with a hard stare. "You're playing a very dangerous game, boy," he said, voice low and firm. "If this is some kind of scam, it's not." Malik's voice didn't waver. His dark eyes stayed locked onto Jonathan's, unwavering, unafraid. "You know it's not." Peter exhaled loudly, shoving his chair back as he gestured to a nearby waiter. "Get this kid out of here," he ordered. The waiter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. He glanced at Jonathan, silently asking for confirmation. But before Jonathan could speak, Malik took a step forward. "Go ahead," he said, his voice quieter now. "Call the police, have me thrown out, but ask yourself one thing. What if I'm telling the truth?" Jonathan clenched his jaw. The words hit him harder than he wanted to admit, because that was the problem, wasn't it? What if? His mind raced through every deal he had made, every competitor he had crushed, every family he had stepped over to climb to the top. He had enemies, many of them, And if someone really wanted revenge, what better way than to slip something into his food? The steak sat there, mocking him. His gut twisted. Something was wrong. He felt it now. With a sudden movement, Jonathan turned toward the cafe entrance and snapped his fingers. "Get me the manager," he barked. A few seconds later, a tall man in a crisp black suit hurried over. His name tag read, Edward, General Manager. He had clearly caught wind of the growing spectacle but maintained a neutral expression. "Mr. Davenport, is there a problem?" Edward asked smoothly. Jonathan exhaled sharply, steadying himself. "I want you to send my meal to the kitchen. Have someone inspect it. Now." Edward blinked in surprise. "Sir, inspect it?" Jonathan's patience snapped. "Did I stutter? Get the damn plate tested." The room tensed. A few of the waiters exchanged uneasy glances before Edward hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Of course, sir." He gestured toward a server, who quickly scooped up Jonathan's plate and disappeared into the kitchen. The moment stretched unbearably. Peter groaned, rubbing his temple. "Jonathan, this is ridiculous. You're seriously letting some kid—" "Shut up, Peter," Jonathan snapped. Malik stood perfectly still, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His breathing was steady, his expression unreadable. Minutes passed. Then the kitchen doors swung open. A chef, still in his apron, walked out, looking uncomfortable. He whispered something to Edward. Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears as he watched the manager's expression change. At first neutral, then tight-lipped concern, then alarm. Edward turned toward Jonathan, clearing his throat. "Sir, perhaps we should speak privately." A chill spread through Jonathan's chest. Peter scoffed. "Oh, for God's sake, what now?" Jonathan didn't even glance at him. He pushed his chair back and stood. "Lead the way," he said stiffly. A terrifying truth. Inside the cafe's private dining room, the air was thick with tension. The head chef, Edward, and two waiters stood before Jonathan and Peter, shifting uncomfortably. Jonathan's patience was wearing thin. "Tell me," he demanded. The chef wiped his hands on his apron. "Mr. Davenport," he began cautiously, "your meal was tampered with before it reached your table." Peter choked on a laugh. "Oh, come on." But Jonathan didn't move. He felt it now, the cold grip of real fear. Edward continued, his voice lower now. "We don't know exactly what was added yet, but we noticed an irregular texture in the sauce. It didn't come from our kitchen." Jonathan's stomach dropped. He turned slowly toward Malik. The boy met his gaze, unblinking. "You knew," Jonathan murmured. Malik's lips pressed together. "I told you." Peter was still in denial. "This is absurd. Maybe it was just a mix-up." "It wasn't," Edward cut in, "and whoever did it knew what they were doing." Jonathan felt lightheaded. How close had he been? A single bite? A single sip of wine? His hands curled into fists. Who? And then a realization hit him like a freight train. He turned back toward Malik. "You said your father worked for me." Malik's jaw tightened. Jonathan took a step closer. "You said I ruined him, that I destroyed your family." The tension in the room crackled like static. Malik's fingers twitched at his sides. "That's right." Jonathan stared at him for a long moment. Then his eyes narrowed. "Then tell me, kid." He leaned in slightly, his voice a whisper now. "If someone was out to kill me, why did you stop them?" The room fell deathly silent. Malik's breath hitched, his fingers curled into fists. Jonathan saw it, the way the boy's eyes glimmered, not just with anger, but something deeper, something conflicted. And suddenly, Jonathan realized the terrifying truth. Malik knew who did it, and if Malik knew, that meant it wasn't over, not even close. The silence in the private dining room was suffocating. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on everyone present. Jonathan Davenport, a man who had built his empire on control, no longer felt in control. His mind raced as he stared into Malik's unwavering eyes. The boy knew who had tried to poison him, and yet he had stopped it. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice quieter now, edged with something rare, uncertainty. "You could have let me eat it." Malik's fists tightened, his breathing uneven. "I could have," he admitted, "but I didn't." Jonathan studied him for a long moment, his pulse still hammering from the near-death experience. He thought of all the lives he had ruined, all the people who had every reason to hate him. It wasn't just Malik's father, there were many others. For the first time, he wondered how many of them were still watching. Peter broke the silence, scoffing as he leaned back. "All right, enough of this dramatic nonsense. The kid got what he wanted. Attention. Can we move on?" Jonathan's jaw clenched. He turned toward the head chef. "I want a full investigation into how my meal was tampered with. Every employee in this restaurant is to be questioned." Edward nodded stiffly. "Of course, Mr. Davenport." But Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned back to Malik, his gaze sharp but no longer dismissive. "You could have walked away," he said. "So why didn't you?" Malik hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Because I'm not like you." Jonathan's breath caught. Malik's voice was steady now, his expression resolute. "I've seen what greed, revenge, and power can do to people, how it turns them into monsters. I don't want to be like that." Jonathan felt something stir in his chest, something unfamiliar, shame. For years he had justified his actions as business, survival, winning. He never cared about the damage left in his wake. Until today, until the son of a man he had ruined saved his life. Malik turned toward the door as if he was finished here. Jonathan should have let him walk away, but instead he said something that even he didn't expect. "Wait." Malik froze. Jonathan reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black leather wallet. He retrieved a business card, one he rarely gave out. He held it out. "Come to my office on Monday," he said. "We need to talk." Malik stared at the card, then back at Jonathan, his face twisted with confusion, suspicion, and something else. Hope. He hesitated before finally taking it. Jonathan let out a breath, his voice lower now. "You saved my life today. Maybe it's time I start repaying some of the ones I've taken." Malik said nothing, but the way his fingers gripped the card, like it was something precious, said enough. And as the boy stepped out into the cold city streets, Jonathan knew that this wasn't just an end. It was a beginning. This story isn't just about Jonathan and Malik. It's about the choices we make when faced with injustice. Jonathan had spent his life taking from others, believing power was all that mattered. But when his life was on the line, the person he had once destroyed was the one who saved him. Because real power isn't about money or influence. It's about doing what's right, even when no one is watching. So ask yourself, what kind of person will you choose to be? If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful real-life lessons. Because sometimes the smallest actions can change lives.